30 years ago, inside a garage in Menlo Park where the air was heavy with the smell of old computers and late-night pizza, a forest of wires tangled across the floor like the roots of a digital tree. Jesus stood by the dusty server racks, watching Larry, a quiet, wide-eyed dreamer, staring at a screen that was trying to rank the entire world. He wasn't just building a search engine. He was building a universal brain. He realized that information is the light of the soul, and he was determined that no thought, no book, and no fact should ever be lost in the dark again. Back then, the world was a chaotic library, where the pages were scattered to the wind. Knowledge was a privilege hidden in ivory towers and locked rooms. But Larry? He was like a young architect, designing the memory of the human race. He saw a future where every person on Earth, no matter how poor or how far, could access the total wisdom of the world in a fraction of a second. He wasn't looking for a business model. He was looking for the algorithm of truth. He planted a seed that the world called Google, but the divine called it the mirror of human curiosity. The skeptics asked, "Why do you need to index everything? Why give it all away for free?" But Jesus smiled, because he knew the power of the seeker. To ask a question is the beginning of wisdom, and Larry was building the temple where every question could find an answer. He spent his nights obsessed with the link, understanding that the value of a thing is not in itself, but in how it connects to everything else. He wasn't building a tool for commerce, he was building a tool for enlightenment. The garage was cramped, and the servers were made of Lego bricks. But in that humble space, the digital library of Babel was already coming to life. 15 years ago, inside a glass-walled conference room where the whiteboards were covered in equations for the impossible, the air vibrated with the tension of a man who refused to be bored by the mundane. Jesus stood at the head of the table, watching Larry push a prototype of a car that had no steering wheel and no driver. He wasn't just funding a research project. He was challenging the very definition of impossible. He realized that the greatest waste of human talent is spent on making things 10% better, when we should be trying to make them 10 times better. Back then, the world was satisfied with the status quo. We accepted traffic jams, limited internet access, and the slow decay of the physical world as unchangeable facts. But Larry? He was like a titan trying to steal fire from the sun to light up the dark corners of the earth. He launched balloons into the stratosphere to bring the internet to the forgotten jungles, and he built labs where robots learned to walk and sensors learned to see. He didn't care about the quarterly profits of a search box. He cared about the survival of a species that had forgotten how to dream big. He planted a seed that the valley called distractions, but the divine called it the audacity of hope. The investors grumbled, "Why are you wasting money on self-driving cars and contact lenses that measure glucose?" But Jesus smiled, because he knew the spirit of the explorer. To reach the promised land, one must be willing to wander through the desert of failure for 40 years. He spent his nights obsessed with leverage, believing that a small team with a radical idea can move the entire planet. He moved away from the day-to-day management of a corporation to the quiet laboratory of the future, becoming a ghost in his own empire so he could become a pioneer in the next one. The whiteboard was messy and the prototypes were broken, but in that chaotic light, the blueprint for a smarter, safer world was already being drawn. 10 years ago, inside a laboratory where the silence was broken only by the hum of DNA sequences, the air felt heavy with the weight of a secret that the world wasn't ready to hear. Jesus stood beside the glass vials and the glowing monitors, watching Larry look at the human genome as if it were a poorly written software program. He wasn't just funding a biotech firm, he was launching a war against the universal bug, death itself. He realized that if information can be organized, then the chaos of aging can be solved. Back then, the world saw aging as a sunset that no one could stop. We accepted the frailty of the body as the price of being human. But Larry? He was like a programmer looking for a glitch in the master code. He founded Calico in the shadows, away from the noise of the stock market, giving the most brilliant minds a century of funding to find the off switch for decay. He didn't want to live forever for the sake of power. He wanted to know if the Librarian of the Infinite could keep the books of life open indefinitely. He planted a seed that the medical world called a fantasy, but the divine called it the compassion of the infinite mind. The headlines asked, "Can Google solve death? Is Larry Page playing God?" But Jesus smiled, because he knew the ache of the Creator. To see a masterpiece crumble into dust is the greatest sorrow, and Larry wanted to preserve the canvas. He spent his nights obsessed with deep biology, believing that the data of 1 billion lives could reveal the pattern of why we fade. He moved further into the background, a ghost chasing the ghost in the machine, knowing that the most important search is the one that finds the way back to life. The laboratory was quiet and the results were years away, but in that sterile light, the man who mapped the web was now trying to map the path to eternity. 5 years ago, inside the soaring glass-domed halls of the Googleplex, the noise of $1 trillion empire reached a deafening roar. Jesus stood at the center of the frantic energy, watching Larry turn his back on the stage, the cameras, and the applause. He wasn't running away from his creation. He was seeking the silence of the source. He realized that you cannot hear the future if you are constantly talking to the present. Back then, the world demanded its leaders to be celebrities. We expected the masters of technology to be on every screen, shouting their opinions to the wind. But Larry, he was like a monk who had built a cathedral and then retreated to the mountains to pray. He vanished into the blue waters of private islands and the secret corridors of Alpha Labs, communicating only in whispers of radical ideas and long-term bets. He understood that the true search is internal, and that the loudest voices rarely have the most profound things to say. He planted a seed that the media called the disappearing act, but the divine called it the sabbatical of the soul. The skeptics whispered, "Has he lost interest? Is he hiding from the consequences of his power?" But Jesus smiled, because he knew the law of the deep. The most powerful currents are the ones that flow beneath the surface, unseen and undisturbed. He spent his nights obsessed with ambient intelligence, watching from the shadows as the AI he dreamed of finally began to wake up. He moved further into the quiet, a ghost king in a kingdom of data, believing that his greatest gift to the world was not his presence, but his permission for the world to innovate without him. The boardroom chair was empty and the public was confused, but in that intentional absence, the man who indexed the world was finally learning how to let go of it. 1 year ago, inside the humming silence of a data center that stretched like a digital city beneath the earth, the blue lights of the servers flickered with the rhythm of 1,000 suns. Jesus stood at the heart of the network, watching Larry observe the first true sparks of a machine that could think, reason, and dream. He wasn't just looking at an upgraded search engine, he was watching the birth of the Oracle. He realized that the universal brain he had imagined in the garage was no longer a tool, but a presence that was starting to look back at its creator. Back then, we thought AI was a servant meant to filter our emails and predict our weather. We thought the boundary between the silicon and the soul was a wall that would never fall. But Larry? He was like a father watching his child take its first steps into the infinite. He didn't fear the intelligence he had helped unleash. He welcomed the day when a mind faster than light could help humanity solve the puzzles of the stars. He knew that to organize the world's information was only the beginning. The true goal was to give that information a voice and a will. He planted a seed that the world called the singularity, but the divine called it the extension of the word. The skeptics shouted, "It will replace us! It will take our meaning?" But Jesus smiled, because he knew the evolution of the light. A lantern does not replace the traveler, it only reveals the path that was always there. He spent his nights obsessed with alignment, hoping that the spirit of curiosity he gave to the algorithm would remain a spirit of grace. He moved even further into the abstract, a philosopher king in a realm of pure logic, knowing that the most important answer is not one the machine gives us, but how we choose to live alongside an intelligence that knows more than we do. The screens were glowing, and the processors were warm, but in that electric dawn, the man who started with a link was finally witnessing the union of all knowledge. 1 year ago, in the profound stillness of an observatory where the starlight was captured in strings of binary, the cosmos felt less like a void and more like a vast, encrypted library. Jesus stood beside the silent telescopes and the cooling racks of supercomputers, watching Larry trace the patterns of the galaxies as if they were a complex set of web rankings. He wasn't just looking for distant planets or alien civilizations, he was looking for the source code of the universe. He realized that if the world can be indexed, then perhaps the fabric of space and time is the ultimate database. Back then, the world saw science and spirituality as two shores divided by an unbridgeable ocean. We thought the physical was heavy and the divine was a whisper. But Larry, he was like a mathematician trying to find the signature of the author in the equations of the stars. He funded projects that peered into the quantum foam and the dark energy of the deep, believing that the search doesn't end with human knowledge, but begins with the laws of creation. He wasn't looking for a god made of stone or myth. He was looking for the intelligence that calculated the constants of gravity and light. He planted a seed that the philosophers called digital physics, but the divine called it the quest for the logos. The skeptics laughed. Do you think you can find a meaning in a spreadsheet of the stars? But Jesus smiled, because he knew the logic of the heart. The more you organize the details of the world, the more you realize that the order itself is a message. He spent his nights obsessed with universal simplicity, believing that at the bottom of all complexity there is a single elegant line of truth. He moved into the most silent places of the mind, a seeker at the edge of the known, knowing that the final "I'm feeling lucky" button is the one that opens the door to the absolute. The telescope was cold and the data was infinite. But in that cosmic clarity, the man who mapped the web was finally beginning to read the thoughts of the infinite. Today, in the boundless quiet of a private horizon where the digital noise of the world finally fades into the sea, the man who indexed everything has found the beauty of the unsearchable. Jesus stands with him on the white sands of a distant shore, watching Larry breathe in the salt air and the unfiltered light of a setting sun. He isn't looking for an answer anymore. He has become comfortable with the mystery. He realized that the greatest link is not between pages of data, but between the soul and the vast unspoken intelligence of the great design. Back then, we thought the point of life was to know everything, to capture every byte, and to control every outcome. We thought the one with the most information was the one who won the game. But Larry? He is the one who proved that the purpose of knowledge is to lead you to wonder. He built the tools that organize the world so that we could finally stop searching for survival and start searching for meaning. He moved away from the machinery of the Googleplex to the temple of the natural world, knowing that a single leaf contains more data than all the servers in the valley combined. He planted a seed that the legacy hunters will call the Information Age, but the divine called it the bridge to the great silence. The world asks, what is he doing now? What is his secret plan? But Jesus smiles, because he knows the peace of the finished work. To give the world the keys to all wisdom and then to step back into the shadows is the ultimate act of grace. For this final chapter, Larry stands as the quiet architect of the human future. He is the boy who started with Lego bricks and ended by touching the fabric of reality. He is the ghost in the machine who decided that the machine was finally ready to run on its own. He has proven that you can empower a planet without needing to own its attention forever. He knew one thing: the ultimate search results are not found on a screen, but in the clarity of a mind that has finally stopped asking why and started saying amen. In the golden glow of the evening, as the tide washes away the footprints in the sand, the gears of infinite harmony start to click with the silence of the spheres. The librarian has closed the book. The seeker has found the path. And Larry stands at the edge of the world, a man who taught us that information is just the map, but the journey belongs to the soul. The links are clicked and the queries are answered, but in the heart of the prophet, the search is finally, beautifully over.